Ever heard that saying, all that glitters is not gold?
Mm-hmm.
Well, today we're going to dive into a prime example of that.
Okay.
Cuba's international medical missions.
Right.
They, on the surface look like these lauded displays of humanitarianism.
Yeah.
But today we are focusing on their work in Angola. And let me tell you, the reality, it's far more complex than those glossy brochures might suggest.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We are taking our cues from this incredible two-part investigative report by Anarela Grimal. It's for El Toqui, which is an independent Cuban digital magazine, and Connectus, which is a Latin American investigative journalism platform.
Oh.
And she really went in depth. She looked over thousands of financial records, contracts, all sorts of documents. And I think this is most important, she spoke directly to the Cuban doctors and workers who have experienced this system firsthand.
And it's through those stories that I feel like this idea that this is as much a system of profit as it is humanitarian aid really comes to light.
Absolutely. And this isn't exactly breaking news. Whispers of exploitation have been circulating for years.
Right.
But this investigation gives us the data to actually understand the financial machinery at play here.
Okay, so for those who need a little bit of a refresher, Cuba and Angola, this goes way back, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about Operation Carlota in the 70s and 80s, where Cuba sent troops, military advisors to support Angola during its civil war.
Yeah, and that military presence never really ended. So after the war, that kind of morphed and transitioned into what they call solidarity business.
Okay.
And basically what that means is they export professional services, they send doctors, teachers, engineers abroad, and it's a way for Cuba to generate some much-needed foreign currency.
We're not talking about, small potatoes here. Like Cuba made somewhere between $4.8 and $9.6 billion just from sending troops during the war.
Wow.
That's a lot of cash. That kind of cash flow tends to make you want to maybe stick around a little bit longer than you might have originally planned, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this whole move toward this solidarity business, it very conveniently coincided with a massive scandal that really rocked Cuba. High-ranking General Arnaldo Ochoa, he was tried for treason. And the trial really exposed that the Cuban military had been involved in smuggling. We're talking ivory, diamonds, all sorts of things.
Wow.
Some even whispered about drugs.
So they needed a new image. They needed a new way to make money without, this shadow of corruption looming so large.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that's where Antex enters the picture.
Okay.
Antex, it's short for Antillean Exporter Preleg. It's this Cuban military-owned company that acts as the intermediary for all Cuban workers in Angola.
Okay.
So think of them as like the puppet master. They control salaries, living conditions, all of it.
And when you say controlling, what we really mean is taking a hefty cut, right? Grimmel's investigation, what she finds is that Antex keeps a staggering, are you ready for this, 76 to 91% of a Cuban worker's salary.
Wow.
That means that if Angola pays a doctor, let's say, $5,000 a month, that doctor might only see like $450 to $650 of that amount.
Right.
Which is insane.
It is. And that's where this term solidarity starts to leave a really bad taste in your mouth, because you're talking about highly skilled professionals essentially being paid a pittance compared to what the Angolan government is actually shelling out. It's a system that seems to be built on exploitation.
Okay, so let me get this straight.
Yeah.
Cuban workers are being told they're going abroad to help people. They're embodying the spirit of international solidarity.
Right.
But then a huge chunk of their earnings is being siphoned away by their own government. It's messed up.
Yeah, messed up is a good way to put it.
It is. And sadly, that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Oh, no.
So in addition to that hefty cut that Antex takes, the investigation also uncovered these forced donations.
Forced donations? What are we talking about here?
Basically, Cuban workers, they're pressured to hand over even more of their earnings.
On top of what's already being taken.
Yes. And it's usually for some cause back in Cuba,
So you're already only getting a tiny little sliver of your paycheck.
Right.
And then you're being told, oh, and be grateful for this opportunity.
Right.
And show your gratitude by forking over even more of this already reduced paycheck.
It's a really messed up kind of gratitude, right?
Yeah, I don't think that's how gratitude works. And if that weren't enough, you also have these inflated costs for basic necessities. So we're talking housing, food, even shipping your belongings back home.
Right.
Antex controls all of that.
Of course.
And, well, they're not exactly known for their reasonable prices, let's just put it that way.
So not only are these workers getting a tiny fraction of their already small salary, but then they're also getting gouged on everyday expenses. It's like a vicious cycle.
It is, and honestly, it raises serious questions about whether this system even constitutes a form of human trafficking. Because in the report, Grimmel points out that international organizations have actually voiced these concerns. And honestly, it's not hard to see why.
No, not at all. And you know what? Let's not forget, this isn't just about the exploitation of the Cuban workers, right? What about the Angolan people? What about the people who are supposedly benefiting from these missions?
Right, because here's another layer of irony. You ready for this?
Hit me.
Cuba, a nation that defines itself on providing free health care to all of its citizens, runs a for-profit clinic in Luanda called Meditex.
Oh, wow. Okay, so Cuban doctors are essentially generating profits for their military by charging wealthy Angolans for healthcare, while so many ordinary Angolans struggle to access even the most basic medical care.
You got it. And to add insult to injury, Grimmel couldn't even get clear financial records from Meditex. Their operations are totally shrouded in secrecy.
So it makes you wonder, like, who's really benefiting from this solidarity, right? It's certainly not, like you said, it's not trickling down to the people who actually need it most.
Exactly.
But Meditex, that's just the tip of the iceberg, right?
Yeah. This system goes way beyond healthcare. Grinnell uncovered this vast corporate web with tentacles reaching into construction, oil, mining, you name it, even IT.
And all of it with its ties back to the Cuban military.
You bet. They're either operating under the Antex umbrella or using other names, often ones that have Imbondex in them. And they're winning these really lucrative contracts, often without any transparent bidding processes.
So we've got potential exploitation of workers, lack of transparency, and now we're talking about potentially rigged contracts. That's a familiar recipe, unfortunately.
Sadly, it is. And remember how we talked about that high-profile treason trial?
Right.
It seems some things haven't really changed that much.
Wow.
The report actually highlights some really shady dealings involving these Cuban companies.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, there's this one Imbondex's involvement in the Catembala Airport construction project, and they were working with this Brazilian firm, Odebrecht.
Odebrecht, if you know, you know.
Exactly. And then there's also the issue of land disputes caused by another Imbondex project that's like they're replicating a colonial system, but just with a Cuban flag waving above it.
It's a pattern we see again and again throughout history, right? Powerful entities, they come in with all these promises of development and progress, but what they often leave behind is this trail of exploitation and resentment.
It's a cautionary tale, for sure.
Yeah.
But, perhaps the most concerning aspect of Cuba's presence in Angola is something much less visible, something that's kind of lurking in the shadows of the Angolan government.
You're talking about Cuba's involvement in Angola's defense and intelligence apparatus.
Exactly. So remember those leaked payrolls?
Yeah.
Showing Cuban personnel on the Angolan president's own security detail.
Making a pretty decent chunk of change for protecting the president, right?
Right. But it's more than just a few security guards. This points to something much deeper, and it's Cuba's potential influence on Angola's internal security, which is a scary thought.
Yeah, it's giving, like, advisor who's really calling the shots vibes, you know?
Totally. And given what we know about Cuba's track record in places like Venezuela, where they've been accused of propping up authoritarian regimes, it makes you wonder what the end game is here. What are the long-term implications of this kind of close relationship for the Angolan people?
Right.
But, let's switch gears for a second and talk about another kind of troubling aspect of this solidarity business, and that's the export of goods to Angola.
Okay.
And this is where the irony really starts to sting, I think.
Okay, lay it on me.
Cuba is sending Angola medicines that are in critically short supply back in Cuba.
You're kidding. So while Cuban citizens are struggling to access basic medications, those same drugs are being shipped off to Angola to keep this whole system afloat.
Yep. It's a bitter pill to swallow.
It really is.
The report highlights this one case of azithromycin. It's a very common antibiotic. And it was basically impossible to find in Cuba during a period when they were exporting tons of it to Angola.
Right.
And it's not just medicine either. Blood products are another big one.
Blood products. Like, what does that even mean?
So think like plasma, transfusions, things like that.
Okay, and what's so controversial about that?
Well, blood donation in Cuba is a very complex issue. There have been persistent reports about coercion, about people feeling pressured to donate, especially if they want to, access certain privileges or opportunities.
Wow. So they're potentially exporting something that may have been obtained through exploitative practices in the first place.
Exactly. And it raises questions about the ethical sourcing of these products
Mm.
and who is ultimately profiting from their sale.
Right.
And of course, like everything else we've talked about, transparency is really lacking here.
Which just makes the whole thing even more suspicious.
Right.
It's clear that there's a huge human cost to this system. And it's a cost that's borne by everyone involved. So I think at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, is this solidarity business doing more harm than good?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah, it really does feel like it's easy to get caught up in all of like the financial stuff, the geopolitical maneuvering, but at the heart of the story are real people, right?
Absolutely.
And I think we need to talk about that human cost. We've talked about the financial squeeze, but what about just like the emotional and the physical toll this takes on the Cuban doctors, the workers, everyone caught in this system?
It's one thing to read all the statistics and the contracts and the financial statements, but it's quite another to actually hear the firsthand accounts of the people who have lived through this.
Right.
And let me tell you, those stories paint a really heartbreaking picture.
Yeah, the report mentions Cuban workers dying in Angola.
Yeah. And many of those deaths, they were from preventable diseases, like malaria, for example. I mean, think about that. We're talking about medical professionals. They're often being sent to areas with really limited healthcare infrastructure, and yet they themselves aren't receiving adequate protection or care.
It's so ironic, right? They're risking their well-being, maybe even their lives, to prop up a system that ultimately benefits someone else's bottom line.
Totally. And then on top of the physical risks, you've got the emotional strain. These people are being separated from their families, often for years at a time, and they don't have much choice in the matter.
Right, because we know the Cuban government, they like to keep families back home almost as like a guarantee that their workers will return, right?
Yeah.
It's dehumanizing. It's treating people like pawns in this geopolitical chess game.
It is. And these are fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters
Right.
with their own hopes and dreams and obligations.
Of course, yeah.
And their lives are being disrupted, their families are being fractured, and it's all for the sake of this so-called solidarity.
It really makes you question what that word even means.
It does, and I think it really underscores the need for greater transparency and accountability from both the Cuban and the Angolan governments. For too long, the system has been allowed to operate in the shadows, but I think the tide is turning. I think this investigation, along with work by other journalists and other organizations, is really shining a light on the underbelly of this solidarity business.
Yeah, and that's so critical. But I think at the end of the day, it's easy to feel, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of all of this. So for our listeners, for anyone who's maybe feeling that way right now, what's the one key takeaway that you hope they walk away with today?
I think the most important thing to remember is don't buy into the propaganda. What we see happening in Angola, it exposes a really harsh truth. Cuba's international medical missions, they're not just about altruism. They're this really complicated web of economics and politics and power, and they often come at a really steep cost, a cost that's borne by both the Cuban workers and the people that they're supposedly there to help.
It's a lot to process.
It is.
But knowledge is power. And I think by understanding how the system works, by listening to the voices of the people who are most affected by it, I think that's how we can start to demand better, not just for the people of Cuba and Angola, but for everyone who believes in the idea of genuine international solidarity.
I couldn't agree more. It's time to move beyond the rhetoric and actually start demanding some real transparency, some accountability, and ultimately a system that puts people before profits.
100%. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive today. We covered a lot, but I think the biggest question that we're left with, at least for me, is this. If this is how the Cuban government treats its own people, its most valuable resource, then what does that say about the true nature of the regime?
That's a great question.
It's something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this journey today, everybody. And until next time, keep asking questions, keep digging deep, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.